Alright guys, so continuing our deep dives on the Kingdom Cup today, we're actually looking at a Alolan Marowak, and this one's kind of been an interesting one so far because this is kind of the first real counter that we've found to Lucario, like a decent one. So Alolan Marowak actually has some ground to stand on so far in the meta. With time, as we figure out other counters and things like that, this could end up going some other way, but for now, Alolan Marowak looks to be a pretty good subject to take a deep dive on. So let's actually do that. So Alolan Marowak is actually a Ghost and Fire type Pokemon at level 40 with 15s across the board. You can hit 1835 on the CP charts, which is fairly nice. It's always good to see a Pokemon that ends up at around 1500 for the Great League at its max CP. It always ends up meaning that you get a lot of your stats fleshed out and you don't have to worry about being an underperformer and things of that nature. So you can actually achieve an exact 1500 at level 33.5 if you have a 0 on attack, 14 defense, and 14 stamina there. So, okay. Now, currently the only way to get Alolan Marowak is from raids, so this is going to be quite difficult to get close to. If I'm not mistaken, even if you trade with good friends, you have to account for like a 1-1-1 floor on trades. I know best friends is like either a 4-4-4 or a 5-5-5, whichever one it is. So you kind of have to do a little bit of work if you want to really get to this IV combination, but catching it from raids shouldn't be too big of an issue. It's just trying to min-max your IV stat there could end up causing you some problems. Now, Alolan Marowak does actually rank 13th in bulk. If we're counting the fact that Probopass and Giratina are actually included in this, then he is 13th. If we take those out because one's not released and one is currently impossible to get below 1500, he does rank 11th. And the same goes for Stat Product, which is interesting. He has both 13th or 11th in both categories, which is nice to see. He's really close to the top certain percentile there, and it's always good that whenever a Pokemon has plenty of bulk and plenty of stats to back it up, it ends up being a really good performer as long as its moves kind of help it out here. So let's actually go into our moves. So being that we have Ghost and Fire, I do have them color-coded here. The only two non-stab moves that we have are in black. Hex here is our first fast move here, doing 3.67 energy per turn for a measly 2 damage per turn. Rock Smash coming in with 2.33 energy per turn and a 3 damage per turn. So at first glance, I really thought Rock Smash was going to be the preferred move here, only because the fighting type move really does end up helping you against ice types and steel types in this meta, but Hex really ends up being the top performer here simply because you can get to these charge moves so much quicker. It has a substantial energy advantage here and only 1 damage per turn less than Rock Smash, so nothing really to compare it with whenever it comes with our energy per damage there. Hex just ends up being the preferred fast move for me personally. Next, moving on to our charge moves, we do actually have Bone Club, which is a ground type move, 35 energy for 40 damage with a measly 1.4 damage per energy ratio. Shadow Ball here, 55 energy for 100 damage at a 1.82 ratio. And finishing up with Fire Blast, 80 energy for 140 damage with a 1.75 ratio there. So, oddly enough, in most of the matchups that I've run, Bone Club and Shadow Ball are definitely the preferred movesets here. So with Hex, Bone Club, and Shadow Ball here, you're going to end up doing neutral damage to the majority of the cup, but then you're also going to have this ground type coverage, which ends up helping you really secure a Lucario matchup, and it can help you a lot in the Bastiodon matchup, but Fire Blast could end up doing you some good if you really wanted to run it, but you end up sacrificing a ton of your matchups just to have this fire move. Being that Bone Club is such a low energy move and you can spam it, you get to Bone Club in less than 10 turns. Imagine that. Imagine that you get Bone Club within 5 seconds of joining the match. Like, that's crazy. So Bone Club, extremely spammable. Shadow Ball is not far behind it, costing only 55. Fire Blast is quite a hill that you've got to climb. It does pay off well for 140 damage. In our scenario here, it's much more beneficial to have the quick, fast moves rather than the high energy fast moves. And that kind of shows in terms of our matchups. So I am going to take a little bit of a detour. We're actually going to start doing our positive and negative at the very end of the video, because I've ended up kind of cramming everything that I've learned into those positives and negatives, as before they were more of like a first impression positive and negative thing. So let's actually move on to our matchups here. So all of the subjects that I end up looking at in our deep dives, I always put them up against the top 10 bulkiest Pokemon to see how well they do in the cup. Now, Alolan Marowak has a kind of an interesting situation because it loses a lot, which ends up telling me that it's kind of got a narrow use case, but honestly right now, this use case is probably the best possible use case to have. So let's get into our matches here. So we actually lose up against Bastiodon, Regice, Probopass, Steelix, Altaria, Lapras, Skarmory, Torkoal, and Fortress. Holy cow. So we end up losing to a lot. So some of these probably could be mitigated if you use Fire Blast instead. Things like Skarmory and Fortress will probably end up having a harder time beating you if you can get to this Fire Blast. To be honest, whenever I ran the Sims, I didn't run it with the Fire Blast moveset, so I don't know if we can even get to Fire Blast before Skarmory and Fortress end up killing us. So it could help you in those situations, but it doesn't really do a whole lot against these top 10 bulky Pokemon. The only ones that we win against are actually Registeel and Dugong, which was kind of interesting that we win against Dugong. But as far as our shield usage goes, if we run up a scenario where we have 0 shields versus 0 shields, we actually end up winning 57.7% of the time. So in the event that both my opponent and myself have run out of shields, as in a closer type situation, I do end up winning 57% of the time, which is not bad. I like the fact that we end up winning more than half of them, but it's also not a very great position to be in. Our next scenario where we have 2 shields versus no shields, the reason that we run this is because we want to know what is just going to flat out beat Alolan Marowak, and if we run up against these Pokemon, it's just probably not even worth using shields on them. It's a really hard counter to Alolan Marowak, and those Pokemon are actually Empoleon, and then we actually have Walrein and Bastiodon as well. So it's kind of interesting here because in a 2 versus 0 shield situation, we win 96.2% of those matchups, but we hard out lose to Empoleon, which I definitely want to do a deep dive on very soon. And then we actually tie with Walrein and Bastiodon. So it kind of sucks because Bastiodon is one of those that we really need a good counter for, but it's not really Alolan Marowak's purpose. Next up, we have our 0 shields versus 2 shields. So what happens whenever our opponent hasn't wasted any shields and we have actually exhausted all of ours? How many matchups do we actually win? 9%. Yeah, 9%. And the reason that we run this is because we want to see which Pokemon we just flat out win against no matter how many shields they have. And this kind of tells you what you can really hardcore counter and what you should probably push Alolan Marowak to do if these Pokemon come up. But unfortunately, the only 2 Pokemon that I really saw that Alolan Marowak just hardcore did really good up against were the 2 cast forms, being both the Icy and the Fire form. They just really they were too frail to go up against Alolan Marowak, and Alolan Marowak could pull that out. Now, I think that's honestly because of the neutral damage that we have here, and then Bone Club is just kind of there to be able to be spammed, so you end up getting a lot of spam damage. Lastly, we have 2 shields versus 2 shields, so how does Alolan Marowak do as a lead Pokemon? And we actually have a 65.4% win ratio here, and that's not bad at all. It's not as high as what we've seen in some of the Tempest Cup matches, but it's definitely not too bad compared to what we've seen so far in the Kingdom Cup. So as a lead, it ends up doing pretty well. It's just that it loses to a lot of the hardcore counters, like the top 10 bulkiest Pokemon. Now let's move on to actually what does hardcore counter Alolan Marowak, and then what should you be using your Alolan Marowak for? What should you target with Alolan Marowak? So the things that hardcore counter you are going to be the flying types like Altaria, Charizard, Salamence. All of those Pokemon, you have a really hard time getting off a lot of damage. And that's because Hex isn't going to be super effective to any of those. And Bone Club is going to be resisted by a lot of those, so you're forced to use this Shadow Ball, which really means that you're slower and you don't have like a really super effective way to get rid of those flying types. The next set of Pokemon that have a favorable matchup to you and you should avoid with Alolan Marowak are things that are ground type like Walrein, Steelix, and Flygon. All of those really do end up getting a good grip on Alolan Marowak. Because of this fire typing here, he's going to end up taking a lot of damage from the ground types and you have nothing to go back at them with. So in terms of what should you use Alolan Marowak for, definitely target the ice types like Sandslash, Piloswine, and Cloyster. All of those have a hard time getting around Alolan Marowak. Things that are steel type like Lairon, Magneton, and Lucario all have a big issue with Alolan Marowak as well. Things that you can just really push out a lot of neutral damage and beat them down, and then use this ground type move to just cover them in dirt. Next, let's actually go over our positives and negatives for Alolan Marowak here. So I only have one real big negative one, and we do have quite a few vulnerable weaknesses. Things like ground, rock, and water are really going to be able to hurt Alolan Marowak really hard, and that's kind of crappy because ground types are going to be like sought after, even though they're not included in the cup. Things that have ground type moves are going to be sought after because they do well against the 4 main typings. Then you actually have rock, which kind of ends up hurting us quite a bit. Things that have access to rock type moves like Bastiodon are really going to be able to put a hurting onto our Alolan Marowak here. And of course, water is going to, of course, target that fire type, which means that things like Empoleon and Kingdra are really going to be able to just tear through us. Moving on to our positives though, we do actually have a decent set of resistances here. Things like fighting, fire, and ice, we all resist. Fighting types I think are going to be very important in this meta. Even though they're not included in the main 4 typings, if you have a fighting subtype and you have fighting moves, you are definitely in a favorable position in this meta. And the fact that Alolan Marowak resists those ends up making it a good contender in a lot of situations. Fire type and ice type are both actually included in those main 4, so the fact that we resist a lot of those types of damage end up doing really good. It's always nice to see an ice type resistance when you don't even carry the ice typing. That's always great. Our next positive, and the most important positive I think I could come up with, is that Alolan Marowak beats Lucario. So Lucario is the Pokemon to beat this month. If you cannot beat Lucario on your team, you're gonna pretty much get swept. So you really need to figure out a decent way to combat the Lucario. And being that Alolan Marowak can do it by himself is probably the best thing. Of course, you can, use 2 Pokemon to take down Lucario, but then you're using 2 resources to take down 1, which is just very, very inefficient. The problem with Alolan Marowak is that if he ends up being caught with a Shadow Ball to the face from Lucario, so you have to be extremely careful when you go up against him. You need to have at least 1 shield whenever you find Lucario. So always remember whenever you're going into that matchup to at least have 1 shield. So that kind of does cement the fact that Alolan Marowak does gain a little bit of traction as a lead, because if they decide to lead with Lucario because he's such a positive matchup Pokemon, then you do have the upper hand in that. So all in all, that is my opinion on Alolan Marowak. I definitely think that he's probably best as a lead or a mid for a specialty case, because he does end up having quite a few favorable matchups, but he can be easily targeted by the water types and the ground types on the opposing team. So be on the lookout for that. But that's all I have for Alolan Marowak. Let me know what you guys think about him down in those comments below. And if you actually have any Pokemon that you're looking forward to a deep dive on, please let me know down in the comments below so that I can put it on my spreadsheet, tally them all up, and be knocking them out. Coming up on the dock, we do have things like Melmetal and Blaziken. Those 2 have been highly requested, so those are coming up very, very soon. I promise I'll get to them. But if you guys have any that you are looking forward to, please let me know, and I'll put them in the spreadsheet so that we can get to them even faster. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you like to like videos, make sure you do that. If you don't, you can be that guy. Otherwise, let me know what you have to say down in those comments below. And until our next deep dive, I will catch you then.